Yeah, greetings, my very dear friends. Is your friend, Professor Eddy Ndibuagu, a professor of public health medicine, and then the lead for Community Positive Health Attitude Initiative. We're an NGO that is just working hard to give information about your health. We have a blog channel where the details of all these things you get in YouTube are written, so you can always refer to it. Today, this is the second episode of Diabetes Talk, and we're going to be talking about the types of diabetes and how you make diagnosis of diabetes. Let's talk about type. Classically, diabetes, we have two major types. We call it type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the one they also call juvenile onset diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, it's commoner in children and young adults, people who are 25 years and below. And you'll find out that it's the diabetes you find in 5 to 10% of all the global diabetes you have. Is a rarer form of diabetes, but it's a problem. It's called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus because that type, you require daily dose of insulin to stay alive. So it's really a more difficult problem to handle. The second type of diabetes is what they call type 2. This type 2 is also called adult onset diabetes or insulin-independent diabetes because most times, especially if you don't let it get into the stage of complication, you don't need insulin to treat it. Occurs commoner in people from 45 years and above. And this is the one really that lifestyle modification will help you stay off it. If you know your risk factors, like we said in the other videos, and you start early to take steps to prevent it, you might never have diabetes. Talk less of getting to the very terrible complications associated with diabetes. You'll find it in 90 to 95% of all the diabetes you have in the world. So those are the two broad types of diabetes. But you have smaller classes of diabetes. We have gestational diabetes. Remember, we mentioned it. If you watched our first episode, we mentioned gestational diabetes as a risk factor for having diabetes. It's occurring in pregnant women and is actually pregnancy induced. The problem is that people who have gestational diabetes usually end up having big babies. Frequently, they deliver through cesarean section because of the size of the baby. The other second type of rare diabetes is the one they call pre-diabetes. This is early stage of diabetes. When you make the usual tests for diagnosing diabetes, and the tests are not clearly, they're like borderline. I'll give you the figures when we talk about diagnosis. You say the person is pre-diabetic. And pre-diabetic people are people who must do all they can to avoid tilting fully into full-blown diabetes. And they do this by lifestyle modification and doing all those things we told you about. And then the last minor type is the one we call secondary diabetes. Secondary in the sense that this is the kind of diabetes that if you identify the cause and treat it properly, the diabetes is gone. And it could be as a result of inflammation of the pancreas. Remember, pancreas is the organ that produces insulin that is needed for metabolism of those major nutrients, macronutrients, fat, carbohydrate, and protein. So if you have a problem with it, it could give you secondary diabetes. And once that thing is properly treated, the diabetes goes. Diseases of other endocrine organs, they're what they call Cushing's syndrome. And the common one, is thyrotoxicosis. You have a problem with the thyroid, excessive production of thyroxine and all that. So let's move on and talk about diagnosis. How do you make diagnosis of diabetes? The common thing, like I said, once you start seeing those major symptoms, like we told you, the 3 Ps and weight loss, then you do a blood test. But the recommended one is, I'll tell you all of them, is fasting blood sugar. Once you do a fasting blood sugar is done that you take the specimen in the morning And the advice, it has its own shortcomings anyway, because people most times don't do it well, correctly. The advice is that you take the blood 8 hours after you've eaten. But some people do fasting blood sugar and they eat late in the night, like even or early morning, 2 a.m., and wake up by 7 and want to do it. So long as it's not up to 8 hours, the result is not very reliable. But once you correctly do fasting blood sugar and the result comes out, some of these glucose meter you use in checking the level of sugar in people's blood and those things, they measure them in 2 units. Some say millimoles per liter. The other one is milligram percent, which is milligram per deciliter, So once you have a value of millimoles per liter, that is 7 and above, in milligram percent is 126. Once you have that value, any of those units, then the person is diabetic. But once you have a result that the milligram percent is 100 and less, is normal. But in between that 100 and 126 is what we call the pre-diabetic stage, the other classification we told you. You say the person is not fully diabetic, but the person is pre-diabetic. So again, you have to make everything you can do to make sure that those people that are between 100 and 120, that is 125, that they don't move over to being frankly diabetic. So that is one way of, making a diagnosis of that. The other way is what we call random blood sugar. Random in the sense that it's done randomly. You don't wait. You don't ask the person to fast before you take the blood sample. And that is the type. Most hospitals and clinics these days, they do it for every visiting adult patient. They just take the sample and check. It's good. Some of them, they pick a lot of diabetic people and pre-diabetic people through that process. And once it's done, they usually use that glucometer, some call it glucose meter. Once the result is 11.1 millimoles per liter, which in the other balance is 200 milligram percent and above, you say the person is diabetic, has diabetes. You probably don't need to, do other things. But it's advised that you cross-check it, because random blood sugar, you could be that the person ate so heavily, things that are so sugary and all that, an hour, 30 minutes, or say 2 hours, before that and all that. So it's usually advised that you redo it. But in situations where you have very high values, there are things you do and you get up to 300 milligram percent. Some have 400 and more. You don't need any other thing. That random blood sugar is diagnostic. You can use it and start working on treating diabetes. The other tests they do for outside the random blood sugar they do for diabetes is, they call it oral glucose tolerance test. This is a bit better than random blood glucose, because you use 75 milligram of glucose, feed it to the patient, time the person like 2 hours postprandial after taking it, you measure. Again, you use those values you use for random blood sugar. Again, maybe the random blood sugar, I don't know whether I mentioned that, if the test result is 140 milligram percent and below, is normal. But if it is between 140, I'm talking about, and incidentally it's the same thing with oral glucose tolerance test, the reading is the same thing. If it is between 140 and 199, not up to 200, it's pre-diabetic. But once it's 200 and above, for both oral glucose tolerance test and random blood sugar, is diagnostic. The person has diabetes. The other tests that are usually done for diabetes is what they call glycosylated hemoglobin, test. Some call it glycated, but it's the same thing. These ones is advised that you do it at least twice a year or thereabout, because the result you get tells you the pattern of your blood glucose for the past 3 months, 2 to 3 months. So once you have a test result, those ones, they read it in percentages. That is 6.5%. and above is diagnostic. If you have 5.7, if it is not more than 5.7, is okay. But if it is between 5.7 and 6.5, that is 6.4, it gets up to 6.4, is that one they stay called pre-diabetic stage. So those are essentially the blood tests you do for diabetes. But urine test is so important. I remember in the past, urine test was the main thing they used to monitor. We'll talk about monitoring sugar level, later. Urine test is important. Once you routinely test urine and then it shows there is a glucose, it gives you 1 or 2 pluses of glucose, then you need to, is a pointer that it's possible this person has diabetes. Some say that before you start having glucose in the urine, that the blood sugar could have been up to 10 milligram per liter, which is up to 180 milligram percent. So you find out that you test urine, you watch. If you have sugar, you do the other blood tests to confirm. Again, the use of testing urine, you might have what they call ketones. Ketones tells you that problem is developing. When we talk about complications, you say it. These are acute complications of diabetes. If you start having ketones in the urine, if you let it go further and you have diabetic ketoacidosis, is a problem. So you also do urine tests. Some don't even know they have all these problems until they do that urine test. So those are the tests we do to make a diagnosis of diabetes. My dear friends, you see, it's not difficult. It's not expensive to make diagnosis of diabetes. That's why from Community Positive Health Attitude Initiative, our message is that please, everybody should get screened for diabetes. Get screened and watch your lifestyle, so that you really can, live longer. WHO, what they usually publish key facts. The one they published in September 16th, 2022. He said diabetes can be avoided or the consequences delayed by diet, physical activity, and then treatment of complications, medication, all those you could do to avoid diabetes. And keep urging you to be health conscious. We love you. We love you. And of course, your family, your friends, there are people who love you so intensely, who are going to be affected if you let yourself have diabetes and have complications. The complications, some of them we'll talk about, it can be so bad. Some end up getting amputated. Some end up losing their sight. So many things. Some end up dying. So we are saying, please, do the needful. Don't say it's not your portion. We keep saying it can be anybody's portion. Our Heavenly Father certainly is so merciful. But He lets some of these problems get to us. So all you can do as a human being is take steps and avoid them. Please. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.